There are 3 accounts of Paul's conversion to Christianity found in the book of Acts, and they're all a little bit different, and because of that, some critics have cried foul. Comparing them, skeptical biblical scholar Bart Ehrman says that the 3 accounts differ in numerous contradictory details. Clearly, we are dealing with a narrative that has been molded for literary reasons, not with some kind of disinterested historical report. Ouch. If Luke is a sloppy historian spinning some religious yarn, then there's a problem. If he can't seem to keep from contradicting himself while telling and retelling Paul's conversion, this would cast some doubt on if he ever traveled with or even knew the Apostle Paul very well at all. So let's take a look at Bart's complaints one by one and see if he has a good case against Luke. Here's Dr. Ehrman on the first alleged contradiction. He says, on 3 occasions, Acts narrates the conversion of Paul on the road to Damascus, chapters 9, 22, and 26. Compare them closely to one another and you'll find very odd contradictions. In chapter 9, Paul's companions hear the voice of Jesus talking to Paul, but they don't see anyone. Chapter 22, they see light, but don't hear anything. Which is it? Here are the verses in question. Acts 9:7 says, the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, for they heard the voice but could see no one. Acts 22:9 says, my companions saw the light, but did not hear the voice of the one who spoke to me. I do think that there is a reasonable answer here that dispels the contradiction. Paul's companions saw light, but not Jesus himself. But when we look at Acts 22:9, the emphasis is on the voice. It's not that they didn't hear a sound, they just might not have understood what was actually being said. What could have been just noise to them would have been understandable to Paul. And the Greek verb for hear is also used for the word understood. And in fact, many translations like the ESV, NIV, NET, and NASB actually translate it as understood. Luke even uses this word in the same manner elsewhere. For example, see Luke 6:27, which says, but I say to you who hear, or clearly to those who understand. I don't think that this represents a major problem at all, but Bart has some more objections. He writes, in chapter 9, the companions are left standing while Paul falls to the ground. In chapter 26, they are all knocked to the ground. Which is it? Let's again take a look at the verses for ourselves. Acts 9:7 reads, the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. Acts 26:14 says, and when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's hard for you to kick against the goads. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, the verse stood speechless is possibly only an idiomatic expression that suggests that they were frozen in their tracks, so to speak, not that they were standing up the entire time. So that's strike 2 for Ehrman. But he does have one more gripe about the accounts. In chapters 9 and 22, he says, Paul is told to go to Damascus to be instructed by a man named Ananias about what to do next. Chapter 26, Paul is not told to be instructed by Ananias. Instead, Jesus himself instructs him. Well, which is it? As we'll see in a moment, Paul adapts his testimony based on his audience. But notice that in Paul's speech to Agrippa in Acts 26, Paul doesn't say that Jesus told him not to go. Luke's Christian audience may have been familiar with Ananias and interested in the story, and so they get a lot more details of that in chapter 9. But when speaking to the Jews, Ananias is described as a devout man according to the law, having a good report of all the Jews. So Paul is clearly adapting to his audience, calling Ananias a devout Jew. But why would King Agrippa care about some random Jewish Christian? This omission of Ananias in Luke's account of Paul's speech is not a declaration of the opposite. He's just keeping to the facts that Agrippa would actually care about. That's 3 strikes for Ehrman. He's out. Now we get to the fun stuff. We actually find that on close inspection of Acts 9, 22, and 26, the variations line up with what we know about Paul's circumstances quite nicely, as I've touched on a bit already. There's nothing contrived in the differences, and this bolsters our confidence in Luke's accuracy. Let's check it out. In Acts 9, we get the story of Paul's conversion. Being a medical doctor, Luke's description mentions Paul's subsequent blindness and the scales that fell from his eyes after Ananias laid his hands on him and he was healed. Luke also says that Paul didn't eat for 3 days, and he mentions geographical details like the house of Judas and the street called Straight. These are all little details that a historian and doctor would be interested in sharing with his audience as a narrator. There's also a good bit about the supernatural power of God. This first story is clearly of interest to a Christian audience, but in both of Paul's speeches he omits them as they would be less interesting to those audiences. Let's go on to Acts 22 and see things get really interesting. Acts 22 is Paul's defense at the temple before the Jewish leaders, and he speaks to his audience in Hebrew according to Acts 22, and we also read that he calls them brothers and Christian fathers. He builds common ground, noting that Jerusalem is the place that he grew up. He mentions his training from Gamaliel, a leading rabbi and a member of the Sanhedrin. He speaks of the laws of his ancestors and says that he's just as zealous for God as they are. Instead of calling Ananias a Christian brother, he says that he's a devout observer of the Jewish law and highly respected among all the Jews. Paul doesn't let the Gentile cat out of the bag right away. He says that a voice spoke to him, and that voice was the God of our fathers, and said that he would be a witness to all men. He only mentions the word Gentile in the 21st verse, so he holds out as long as he can, and then once he does mention the word Gentile, all hell breaks loose. It's very clear that Paul is trying to build bridges with the Jews as far as he can, and he's adapting to his audience. If Luke was just lazy and making up a story, it's doubtful that we'd have this story told to us in such vivid detail. Let's see the contrast when Paul testifies to a quite different audience. We're going to now move on to Acts 26. This is Paul's defense before King Agrippa and Festus. Now, here we see that Paul speaks with no concern about a riot interrupting him. He has time to develop a little bit of doctrine and even preaches the gospel to Agrippa. He draws a sharp contrast between himself and his Jewish accusers. Suddenly, the Jews are the bad guys. He speaks sympathetically of Christians, calling them saints. Paul talks about how he forced Christians to blaspheme, which is a self-accusation that fits very well with his own self-blame found in his other letters. He's completely upfront about his mission to the Gentiles, and he says that the voice spoke to him in the Hebrew dialect, probably Aramaic. This is a casual indication that Paul was speaking to a Gentile audience now and was probably speaking Greek. Paul omits the story with Ananias because a story about a devout Jew praying for him doesn't help his cause with a Roman official. Now, notice that this is much in line with what we know about Paul and his letters. Paul said that he became all things to all men in order that some might be saved. These little touches are well explained by Luke having accurate access to what Paul said on this occasion and him carefully recording it. In these three different accounts, we see that Paul's conversion story is told and retold with distinct relation both to the speaker and the audience. It's these little details of how Paul adapts himself that better resonate with his audience and have the ring of truth. They're just rooted in realism and show that Luke is close up to the facts. The upshot here is that it shows that Luke was both knowledgeable and scrupulous in recording Paul's speeches, so just how much more likely is it that Paul and the other evangelists for that matter wouldn't heavily adapt or make up Jesus' speeches? Surely he would likely have been at least as careful about Jesus' teaching, and the same goes for reporting Peter's speeches in Acts, which include him testifying about the apostles eating and drinking with Jesus after he had rose from the dead. Remember earlier that Bart Ehrman says that Luke is a bit of a bungler. He's not writing a disinterested report, he's molding a story for literary reasons, but he can't seem to keep his story straight according to Ehrman. But we see that if he's haphazardly making up a story about Paul's conversion, he's being carefully devious at the same time. Seems to me that the critics can't have it both ways. Either Luke is a doofus, or he's a literary genius, or let's just bring up another third option here. He was a highly reliable reporter. I'm going to go with option 3.